I was reflecting on the question that Anne asked, which I think is a very profound question, frankly. It's not easy for those of us thinking through the rapid change you could see from Philip's beautiful presentation and masterful work. What do you do with endless possibility? It's a good question. And I was thinking that when I was where you all are, now in my day we had a class called iconography. Do you still have that? And what's it called? Well, the first round we all got Fs. Do they still give entirely an F in the first? No. Okay. But what's that? Not here. Well, it was Cummings at that time. And the very first film he showed was of the Nazi concentration camps. I remember that. And it sort of woke us up to this idea that, there is such a thing as aspiration. And you can be really well packed and you can have all your, everything all beautifully put together and you can put yourself in a car. But if you don't know what road you're actually going on, it's pretty dangerous where you might end up. And I thought that as a student, it was really good to have someone ask, do you have a sense of where you're going? Do you have a feeling for where you draw from? Where do you get your ideas from? And, and where do you actually feel when you're connected to the work that you're doing? It was a very important question because I'll tell you at that time, everyone was drawing square windows and everyone was drawing ink on Mylar and everyone had, let's say vast majority, everyone had an Aldo Rossi book on their drawing table. And I remember not that dissimilar from where you all are. I left after third year, but everyone was speaking about this postmodern expression and the Mississauga City Hall competition. I mean, everyone. It was an epiphany of architecture, and I remember that by the time I was done school, virtually everyone had stopped talking about it. And this really caused me to be shaken, this sense that something can pass so quickly that everyone had really bought themselves into emotionally. And then I remembered this wonderful story of an old man, a very old man, and he's on his knees, and he's planting little saplings. You know what a sapling is, right? It's like a tiny little tree. They're about this big, and he's on his knees, and they're fig saplings. And someone comes to the old man and he says, what are you doing, old man? You're on the floor. And the old man turns around and he says, you know what? I'm planting saplings that will become fig trees. And he says, fig trees? You're an old man. You're never going to have and never going to see the fruit of these trees before you die. And he says, yeah, future generations, maybe the next one, maybe the one after that, they'll have the figs from these trees. And he turns around and he says, yeah, but what about you? And the old man says, I take the figs from the trees that were planted 4 generations ago or 2 generations ago. And I was thinking about this idea of having a very long reach, a very long sense as being my best feeling for this question that you've put before us. That what do you do in a rapidly changing world, and how do you acquire a very long sense of a horizon, especially when things in front of us are shortening so fast, including, frankly, the areas where things that used to have very long horizons, like university buildings, are becoming shorter and shorter and shorter. So certain pockets where architecture could rely on that sense of the long reach, that sense has become more and more and more compressed. And then I remember stumbling into a beautiful speech by the architect Luis Barragan. Do you all know the Mexican architect Barragan? And he gave a beautiful speech when he received the Pritzker Prize, which was the very first recipient. And he, in 1967, was speaking about how alarmed he was that the word beauty was no longer being allowed in the discourse within architecture schools, and that words like beauty were seen as soft. And it made me really think at that time, and again, I was more or less at your stage. I was in my fourth year, let's say. I was in my first year down in the States. And I kept thinking about how I was raised, really believing that there's a kind of a wonderful relationship between what you might call the immeasurable things in life, the things that are non-physical, things that you might say are belong to the realm of the unseen or something like that, that really have an extraordinary relationship, we know, with the seen. And there's this wonderful dialogue between the things that you don't see and the things that you do see. And that they feed each other, and that really, when you speak about this realm, it's what you feel when you draw and when you make and what you aspire to, because there's something about us that does reach for the intangible and the immeasurable. We know it, we feel it. It's what makes us go. And I was thinking about that speech that he made and that relationship, and I happened to be across the street from the School of Architecture we were studying at, which was a building by the name, by Louis Kahn, which you all, of course, know. And he has this wonderful art gallery right across the street from the School of Architecture. It would be like for you to go literally just across the street here, and we used to go a lot. And I saw the security guard run his hand across the concrete there. And I just saw something in his face. I don't know what it was. It was this emotional reaction. This something twigged in me where I saw the thing that I really believed in, which is that we have this relationship with architecture, with everything, that causes a kind of an emotional reaction. And what I mean by that is the things that really you can't measure. So you can measure, let's say, program, you can measure function, you can measure things like schedules and budgets. But those are, I think, things that we all have to just kind of do. It's certainly not what we aspire to, and it's not what we live for. And when you make that connection to seeing someone do that, you know, this is not a guy who's studying architecture. This is not someone who has a PhD in architecture, but you can feel that he was moved by that building. And I don't know how many times you've ever actually stepped into a building and you were moved by it, like you would be by a piece of music, or brought to tears. That kind of emotional reaction is very, very rare. And it made me think, at your age, at your time in studying, how is that possible? And it's been a lifelong question, and I wanted to put that out there because I think, just as I love this idea that the seed that is planted generations later becomes a tree, this idea that something has an extraordinary, beautiful, very important relationship with that which we cannot see and touch and understand, and latency, and this idea that we actually do live in a space which is liminal, that the work that you do is tied to, I believe, what resides really very deeply in your hearts, which is an aspiration. And we know that because you, as you draw, right, or work, what gets you to a point where you suffer through all the things that you do to get to the point where you get a kind of a moment, right? And that moment carries all of us. So I just wanted to talk to you about that because, and I wanted to talk to you about that really as a fellow student, because that question has remained with me my whole life, and I continue to think about that, and I continue to watch what really moves people and how they become connected and where do they feel intimate and in touch, and how does all of the things that we work with, which is materials and craft and things well made and proportion. Have you ever thought about proportion? What is it about proportion? That's so magical how certain things feel right, in terms of, and the space between things, which is an extraordinary thing, like music or any composition. How is it that certain things related to each other feel and are right as opposed to feel and are wrong? And of course, you know, the kind of extraordinary power of all the things that we use, like landscape and texture and light. All of these things coming together are very important to try and create this feeling of emotion, which is, I think, a roundabout way of sort of coming at the question that's been asked of us, because I do believe that the word beauty should be at the heart and at the center, and we shouldn't be afraid of it. We should actually ask of it, why is it so robust? And I'll tell you that the project that I'm about to present, when I've had these discussions with the person that I was working with, we asked ourselves, if there was a trade-off between function and beauty, which would we choose? And we came to the point where we said we would choose beauty, because beauty actually is more robust. What defines a chair, if it's really well made and extraordinarily well, the material and the texture and the proportions, you can always find a way to sit on it. You ever notice that? And in fact, how people sit on something changes all the time. And how certain chairs that are 50 years or 75 years old and are just absolutely beautiful stay with us. They're the thing that you hold and you keep in your room. And they might not be the most comfortable of all the chairs, but you hold on to them. And so this idea that there's a durability to something that is beautiful and has this idea of carrying forward. So with that, I wanted to just reveal to you, to open up ourselves as a fellow student, the process of design for the Baha'i Temple in Chile, which you mentioned so graciously. I think what's important for you is that you should know that I actually didn't want to enter this competition. I didn't think that I was at all, or we were at all, worthy of this, because the aspiration was so very high. But I stumbled into a beautiful writing in the Baha'i writings, which speaks about this idea of prayer, and that if your prayer is answered, which already is a very interesting conversation we could have, but if your prayer is answered, then the master returns to his home, and the his is capitalized, suggesting that within us resides, within each of us resides this abode for that prayer being received. And then the pillars of your very being, his very being, would become illumined. And I was thinking of this, I don't know why. Do you know why certain things strike you? Do you know why certain things happen to you? I have no idea. That's a whole other realm of this question of design. But I don't know why, but this writing struck me. And I was thinking, I've met people like that have this sense of radiance, that have this sense of joy, that have this sense of energy. And where does that come from? And I was thinking, how can we create a building that rather than letting light through, would capture light, that would embody light, like when you kiss alabaster with just a little bit of light. You've seen how the alabaster comes alive, and this idea of maybe two possible skins with a very light structure in between. Now, I think this is a very important point. This is an inflection point in our process, because I believe in the idea of story, and I believe in the idea of narrative. I think that the projects should start with that. That really we let the tools follow this, rather than letting the form be dictated by the tool. So this was really an important point where we were just trying this. And then there's this wonderful story of Majnun and Layli. Do you know the story of Majnun and Layli? Majnun is the crazy lover. Is like the Romeo and Juliet of the Middle East. And Majnun is like this crazy lover, and he's digging in the ground for what? His beloved. And I love this image of this guy just clawing the earth, not knowing where he might find his beloved. And this, I believe, is really when we're engaged in a really wonderful design process, is where we don't know where we're going at all. It's completely dark. Do you understand what that means? It's like letting yourself fall backwards, and someone catches you. Have you ever had that feeling in your design process, where you totally let the process take you, rather than you knowing where you're going to go? And we felt the imperative of this project to allow us to do that. We actually removed ourselves from the office. We went to a beautiful little studio that belonged to one of the architects that was within our office. Didn't want to have the phones and all that crap bothering us. And we were going to let the process take us. Now, this is at a cost of what would be a small house. But still, if you're going to go somewhere which surprises you, which is, by the way, I think what you live for, right? If you know where you're going to go, then why go there? That you want the process to completely take you somewhere. So at this point, Majnun is on the floor digging. And what comes in the story is a night watchman. And this night watchman chases Majnun. And Majnun becomes terrified of this night watchman, and he runs. And he runs and hits a wall. Now, anyone that's been in the design process, you know what we're talking about when you hit a wall, right? This idea that, and then so Majnun hits the wall, and great effort, the story says, is needed to climb the wall. And he climbs the wall with this effort after the night watchman put him into terror and took him in a way that he didn't even know where he was going to go. He hits the wall and he starts climbing. Great effort is required. Well, this is another thing I believe now, after 30 years, is this idea of perseverance, sticking with it. Right, Philip? Would you agree with that, having seen your beautiful work? And then he climbs to the top of the wall, and he sees Leili. Leili, of course, is the divine. You see, this is this idea of what are you aspiring to. And then what does he do? He says, oh, I'm just so thankful to this night watchman. Had it not been for the night watchman, I never would have found my Leili, you see. So then you realize the things that give you the most worry, the greatest headache, the most difficulty, that take you in directions that you never knew, actually you go back and you say, oh, thank God for those moments. And so this is, I believe, very beautiful story. It's got to do with life, but it has to do with, I think, design, and has to do with the design process. So at this point, we're just at this crazy point. And you have to be, I think, a little crazy. But then, so we're trying, little forms, making little models, hundreds of them. We started looking like eggs. We couldn't escape the egg. The egg is a very powerful form. Then I saw this little video by a 5-year-old, and it's beautiful. It's like this idea of light moving in different directions. And this idea of movement started to come into it, this idea of reach, which of course makes sense for anything tied to, you see him? And this idea of movement and torquing around the center, which of course in this earliest sketch started to appear, has very archetypal properties. You see it in so many places. And I love this basket. In the Baha'i writings, it says the temples are to be as perfect as is humanly possible. We didn't know, like, how do you define perfection? We have a very Western idea of perfection. And I love this, the edge and the silhouette of this Japanese basket, very much like a cheekbone, right? I started to think about how these forms, or collarbone, or shoulder bone, how these silhouettes have a wonderful perfection to them. And we started, then again, I have no idea where we're going. Just trying, like Majnun, trying different forms. We started to get involved with Maya. This software. But 13 years ago was really on the super crazy side, right? Very soft software, moving around. But this idea that suddenly you start to see within this image a lot of the things that we were aspiring to: softness, movement, symmetry, yet torquing, all of this. But then we were wondering, how do we make that? And then you see the image up there, and just making. See, part of this, which I think for you students is very important, is that this is allowing things to happen without trying to somehow overthink it. I always hated it, both at school and whenever I'm teaching. I really hate it when people start to analyze things too much. And I loved it when I went to school down in the States, when the really good teachers used to have the conference to sit with me at the table and go, that doesn't look right, does it? That kind of conversation. Or what if we try this? Rather than trying to immediately analyze things. Because I think actually logic is the lowest and the weakest forms of our levers in design, or our tools in design. In fact, intuition is a very strong one. And your connection to the work at that level, I think, is really important at this stage to develop. So trying this and trying the different materials, trying the different layers, using materials that we're making models. We weren't doing this using fabrication models yet. We wanted the eye, we wanted the accident, we wanted the sense of malleability that you get with that effort. And still working in sketches. So this is always going back and forth, and then back to the Maya. You see? So then you let the craft and the eye and the hand and the accidents and all of that influence. And so a lot of these slight inflections in the Maya were developed by that. Then we were selected, 180 submissions from over 80 countries, and then we had to figure out, and at that time I was really not happy to enter into this CATIA world. It was very expensive, very difficult, but we ended up having to at that time, and started having to create what we had was largely not measurable, move into a whole measurable and engineerable realm. Of course, we were in the most seismic part of South America, so it had to also have to deal with practical constraints. But all of this is very important that you understand, is that the practical aspects, the fabrication aspects, all of those things followed the narrative and the story and the aspiration. Didn't lead. And I don't think we would have ended up where we did. So this is all just in search of that feeling. The material on the outside, we had to invent a new material because at the end, the pollution in Santiago is so bad that no stone that we had could withstand the cleaning. So we ended up using a cast glass developed with, what a process, 2 years with Jeff Goodman, extraordinary artist. Finally, we ended up with this borosilicate rods that were recycled out of Rochester and broken just in the right way by this wonderful fellow by the name of David. For 2 years, he was breaking glass in this pattern. And we melted it down with these kilns that we built ourselves in Don Mills. They were on a computer just to melt to just the right temperature, and we got this extraordinary pattern that really was doing what we wanted, which was this idea of the prayer answered and the material capturing light. And the stone on the inside, which again, what a search. We found the material in Portugal. It was just this one tiny vein in Portugal. It was an accident. I was doing a house for the inventor of the BlackBerry, and we met this guy that he said, I think I have the stone. We were searching everywhere. We were going to actually go to glass on the inside, and then he led us to this quarry, and the guy said, well, I've been holding on to this material for 7 generations for the right project. So, and then the structure, which, as Philip said, was all prefabricated and then erected in a matter of a very short time. People were astounded. Really came down to a very simple solution, which is all straight pieces with very complex nodes that were CNC'd with a 5-axis. I'm not that particularly crazy about technology doing all this wonder work. What I'm more interested in is whether it gives you something in this. And in the end, I agree with Philip that what was exciting here is that we were able to do this within 3% of our original budget of $30 million US. And that needed this idea of the robotics to get this in the end. And it all went up very simple, no scaffolding. We just had that central piece. Everything went off of the oculus at the top, which I love because it has this extraordinary symbol of the thing that binds everything, which is very symbolic of the purpose of the project, which was to express this idea that all the religions are actually one, which was the idea of the Baha'i Temple. This idea of the unity of all the religions, that everyone would be welcome and open, and that if you were wearing a business suit or a poncho or of any kind of background, that you would feel that this was your place. So the ring at the top became this kind of eye to the heavens. And I like this idea that the work ties back, so that there's really never this idea that anything's new. Everything has a kind of relationship with the very first things in history. And of course that would then track time, and the geometry was such that it was very, very important to us. So it was 30 meters in plan, it was 30 meters in section, and we used, as I mentioned to you, the CATIA was a single complete piece, but then we broke off each of the pieces for the different suppliers, and all the pieces like a jigsaw puzzle had to come together. And same kind of thing that you saw with various forms of machine-to-machine contracts. What I thought was really interesting for me is that everything was on a fixed price. And I like that, because at the end, when we started construction, we could tell the owner what the price was, and at the end we were 400,000 euros over that price because of change orders, which frankly in our world is a miracle given the complexity of this. But even if it was just a box, 400,000 over 30 million is really a minuscule overage. So that was very helpful. Here you can see this time lapse, all the pieces on the right. They're all coming from Germany and other parts of the world, all in containers, and it's all being done with simple lifts and one crane, which at the end we didn't really need the crane that much, and you could see the stone on the inside went up first. What I love here is that the foundation system, because of is so active, the seismic problem here in Chile, that we had to create a super strong foundation system, and then we worked with 3 universities to come up with a seismic isolator, which is a pendulum system which returns back to the center, which means that your building, when it shakes, doesn't end up 3 inches over here or 6 inches over there, right? It has to come back to its center. And I love that because it's, again, very symbolic of what the project is, that this is a symbol of all the religions being one, and at the sub-foundation level, it's like a wagon wheel. It's so primitive. And without that kind of primitive iconography and symbology, you can't even get to the complexity of what's above it. The one piece of iconography is this the symbol of the Baha'i faith at the very top, and of course this torquing becomes very, very important. This idea of movement and stillness, which is so symbolic and so ripe within all of the writings of all the religions. This idea that you have both movement and stillness, motion and stillness within you, and both of these things coexist within you. And then, of course, over time, you can see the tracking of the sun against the surface. And here it is, this idea of embodied light, this idea that also at night it reverses itself. During the early morning, it takes on the dawn. Midday, it becomes like a tent. Afternoon, you have this wonderful glow of that orange afternoon light, and then at night it reverses. And that softness that I spoke about, that was so important. And the subtlety of the geometry really comes out of the big idea. It's not a form simply trying to become complicated. In fact, if I could have, we would have wanted it to be simpler and simpler. And so we spent a lot of time simplifying the curved pieces so that we got it down to 10%. This is one of the earliest drawings in 2003, and you can see that for some reason we put in the Andes. We didn't have the Andes in our site. And but we just thought, why don't we submit it with the Andes? And I like the fact that the drawing, at that time all the computer drawings were looking like Toy Story, and we were making them feel like watercolors from early on, this kind of wonderful softness that we were after, this dreamlike state. And the 5 sites and 9 months, the terror part of this project, you remember Majnun and the Watchman, and he runs and he takes in the story. The terror part is I didn't have a site for 9 months. We went from, as a whole study and a whole presentation that I can tell you is our team looking for the site, because the first site I didn't like, and I proposed to the client, and they said, okay, go find a site. Then the country loved this project so much, they put it in the middle of the city. And then it caused all kinds of commotion, where we said, well, the whole project is not about division and contention. And so we had to go, and through a whole series of accidents, wonderful accidents, we ended up, I think, in the most beautiful site. So here we are against the mountains, as it turns out, even though we didn't have them. And At night, this is the reversal, and this is the site, overlooking all of Santiago, right on the edge of the Andes. And the gardens, which is such an important part of the project. We worked with Juan Grimm, the celebrated South American landscape architect, and we developed this plan that really the geometry of the building just swirls out and becomes 9 prayer gardens, which have this kind of future 400-year design mandate for this project. You remember the idea of putting in a little sapling and then 4 generations later? Well, right now, that's what it is. And so it's a garden that will come alive in a few years. We have this a big water piece that holds back, and then there's the project just last winter there. We had the first snowfall in a couple of years, so pretty nice to see it in the white spring. And open on all sides, welcoming. And the opening, which was last October, 5,000 people came. And in fact, 4 Sundays ago, I was telling Anne that I was just there yesterday. It's a big problem. It's a good problem. It's a wonderful problem. But they're having so many visitors. They had 18,000 people come in one Sunday. And so they don't know what to do because there's only like about a couple hundred Baha'is in Santiago. And so it's a really interesting phenomenon. But there you have it. Thank you.